Hey guys, let's start at the beginning, at the exact moment in prehistory when someone, somewhere, opened their mouth wide, inhaled slowly, stretched their jaw, and accidentally invented the first political statement. I'm bored, I'm tired, or I'm not impressed. Of course, nobody wrote it down. All we have is the shared legacy of that ancient yawn, still rippling through time. We tend to treat yawning as a bodily glitch, a sleepy hiccup in the day. But if you watch closely, really watch, it's a subtle form of communication. And in politics, communication is everything. The history of yawns is, quietly, the history of power, of leaders trying not to yawn, crowds trying not to yawn back at them, and entire civilizations catching emotional contagions that spread faster than any speech. Long before there were parliaments and podiums, there were fires and circles and chiefs. Picture a small group of early humans huddled around flames, the night stretching black around them. They don't have constitutions. They have whoever is loudest, strongest, or most charismatic. One figure stands, gesturing wildly, grunting out some proto-speech about moving camp or hunting over that hill instead of this one. And somewhere in the back, a listener yawns. The yawn isn't just tiredness, it's a primitive vote of no confidence. The jaw stretches, eyes water, the lungs drag in cool air, maybe trying to sharpen a dull brain. Others see it, and, as yawns do, they spread. Suddenly, half the circle is yawning, and the would-be leader realizes he's losing the room. Long before applause meters, poll numbers, or approval ratings, there was the contagious yawn, silently announcing, "You're not holding us." Anthropologists like to talk about yawns as a form of social mirroring, a neural sympathy trick that binds group members together. In politics, this mirroring becomes a mirror held up to authority. A crowd that laughs together can be led. A crowd that yawns together is slipping away. Imagine an early tribe facing two rival figures vying for control. One tells stories that keep the listeners leaning forward, pupils dilated, muscles ready. The other drones. With every dull word, a new yawn blooms across the circle. People shift their weight, eyes glaze, attention floats. In that ancient contest, yawns are the earliest opinion polls. The leader with fewer yawns wins. As human groups grew into villages and villages into cities, the yawn kept evolving politically. Think of early Mesopotamia, where mud brick cities rose between rivers and rulers claimed divine authority. Priests watched the sky and the entrails of sacrificed animals for omens. You can almost picture a temple scribe, tablet in hand, beginning to wonder, if the gods speak through storms and eclipses, what do they say through the people's faces? The king's proclamation is read aloud in the public square, laws about grain, taxes, irrigation. The crowd listens, and a wave of yawns moves like a whisper through them. There is no rebellion, not yet. But there is something else, indifference. And for rulers, indifference is as dangerous as anger, because it means the people are mentally wandering off, imagining other possibilities. Somewhere along the Euphrates, a very practical official may have realized this. Ordering longer decrees did not make people more loyal, it just made them more tired. So there's a political pivot. Keep it shorter, keep it sharper, keep it less yawn-inducing. A crude form of speechwriting emerges, not to inspire lofty ideals, but simply to keep the citizens' eyes from drooping. You could say that the first political communication strategy was not win hearts and minds, but avoid mass yawning. In ancient Egypt, where pharaohs were gods on earth, the politics of yawning took on a more theatrical flavor. Court life revolved around ceremonies, processions, and carefully choreographed displays of power. The pharaoh appears on a balcony, the crowd below baking in the sun, waiting for a glimpse. Priests recite prayers, dignitaries stand in heavy jewelry, desperately trying not to fidget. Someone near the back, exhausted by the heat and spectacle, yawns. The neighboring onlookers catch it. Soon there's a shimmering line of opened mouths in the crowd. Up on the balcony, an advisor notices and leans in. The pharaoh, painted and perfect, is told that the people are yawning. Is it disrespect? No one can say that out loud. So it becomes framed another way. It's an omen, a sign that the gods require more grandeur, more spectacle. The answer to yawns is pyramids, bigger parades, higher obelisks. Politics becomes architecture, and the stone monuments of Egypt might be read, if you like, as huge, enduring attempts to keep history itself from yawning. Yet yawning was not always merely a sign of boredom. In some places, it was treated as a kind of vulnerability, a gap in the armor of the powerful. The open mouth exposes the throat and the back of the tongue, soft, delicate, unguarded. For a warlord or a king, that moment of involuntary exposure might feel like a tiny betrayal of strength. There's a story, half legend, half analogy, of an Assyrian commander who refused to sit during briefings because he believed yawning while seated made him look weak. He stood through hours of reports while his officers, fighting their own yawns, shifted on their feet. He stamped out his own yawns, perhaps, but he planted dozens more in the ranks. As we move westward and forward into ancient Greece, yawning finally meets formal politics. Here, in the bustling agora and the echoing assembly, speeches are no longer just proclamations, they are tools of persuasion. Citizens, well, male citizens, gather to debate war, taxes, alliances. Loquacious men step up to address the crowd, vying for influence. The stakes are higher. The art of rhetoric is born, and with it, the art of preventing yawns. Imagine an Athenian orator standing before hundreds of citizens on a warm afternoon. The air smells of dust and olive oil. He has 30 minutes to convince them to send ships against a rival city, which will cost money, blood, and possibly ruin. He launches into his arguments. If he is good, his voice rises and falls. His gestures carve the air. If he is bad, his words tangle, his tone drones, and somewhere in the fourth row, someone yawns. It starts as a small crack in the collective attention. Nearby, another jaw stretches, then another. The speaker notices. His heart jumps. He shifts tactics, throwing in a joke or a sharp question to jolt the audience awake. The battle is not just against opposing arguments, but against the creeping contagion of boredom. The Greeks talked endlessly about persuasion. Ethos, pathos, logos. They wrote treatises on structure and style, but one unwritten rule governed all. If your speech makes them yawn, your ideas will die. Pericles, the golden-tongued statesman who guided Athens in its prime, understood this instinctively. Accounts of his oratory describe an almost hypnotic effect. He could hold listeners for hours. Some said his words were like a spell. You could also say they were an antidote to yawning. In a city where citizens literally voted after hearing speeches, controlling the emotional temperature of the crowd, keeping their minds alert and their jaws shut, was a source of political power. Even the philosophers were not immune. Socrates, in his patient, probing way, would stand in a circle of young men and dissect definitions of justice or virtue. As he tugged at their assumptions, some of his pupils would shift sleepily. Not everyone is built for endless questions. Somewhere in that circle, a tired student would stifle a yawn, trying not to offend the great man. But Socrates, dogged observer of human behavior, surely noticed. Perhaps he saw yawns as signs of unexamined life. When the mind stops engaging, the body starts protesting. He might have used the yawn as a challenge. If you're tired, it's because you're not thinking hard enough. To the north and east, in Persia, yawning played a quieter role in empire. The great kings, Cyrus, Darius, Xerxes, ruled vast territories where dozens of languages and cultures coexisted under one imperial umbrella. Royal audiences were choreographed scenes of hierarchy, petitioners waiting for hours or days to present their pleas. They stood in decorated halls, flanked by carved stone soldiers who never blinked, much less yawned. The human guards, however, did yawn. Watching over endless processions of nervous supplicants, they were forced into that peculiar political discipline, the effort to appear both alert and at ease, untroubled by fatigue. A guard's uncontrolled yawn in front of the king might be seen as disrespect, as if the king's mere presence were not enough to keep human biology at bay. So yawns became small acts of rebellion at the edges of power, suppressed whenever possible, but breaking through like tiny cracks in the marble. If we travel further east to ancient China, the politics of yawns intersect with ritual and etiquette. Confucian thought placed enormous importance on propriety, on knowing where to stand, when to bow, how to speak. In such a world, yawning in front of a superior was not simply a physical act. It was a breach of decorum, a subtle insult that could imply that the superior was not worth staying fully awake for. Court officials, gowned in stiff robes, stood through long ceremonies, listening to edicts that repeated familiar phrases about harmony and order. In the hush of the court, anyone who felt a yawn creeping up had to discipline both body and face, pressing the moment down into their chest or hiding it behind a sleeve. It was not enough to obey, one also had to look engaged. Rulers, too, were trapped in this theater. An emperor who yawned during his ministers' reports risked signaling disinterest in matters of state. The room watched him as carefully as he watched them. One emperor, according to a later anecdote, ordered that any official who caused him to yawn through a dull report would be required to revise it overnight. The aim was not just better governance, but better performance, more efficient, less soporific. Policy became, in part, a war on boredom. Meanwhile, in the Indian subcontinent, kingdoms and republics rose and fell, and court poets spun elaborate praise for their patrons. A king's glory was described in long, ornate verses rich with metaphors. These were recited for courtiers at banquets and celebrations, each word intended to inflate the ruler's aura. But no matter how divine the king, his listeners were ordinary humans. They got hungry, they got drunk, and they got tired. Somewhere between the 78th and 79th line of a particularly florid panegyric, a noble might yawn behind his hand. The gesture was risky. Praise poems weren't just flattery. They were political instruments meant to affirm loyalty and establish consensus about the ruler's greatness. A yawn in that context was like a tiny crack in the facade of unanimous admiration. We tend to think of power as armored and invincible, but across all these early civilizations, yawns reveal its fragile dependence on attention. A leader may command armies, but can they command wakefulness? They can pass laws, but can they prevent boredom? The yawn, involuntary and contagious, reminds everyone that the body has its own agenda, one that sometimes conflicts with the grand designs of rulers. It is in the Roman world, though, that yawns become almost a political actor in their own right. The Roman Republic, and later the Empire, were obsessed with public display, forums, courts, games, and senatorial debates. Rome's leaders understood that power lived not just in decrees, but in perceptions. And perception is a fickle creature, easily dulled. Picture the Roman Senate on a long, hot day. Marble columns echo with voices. Toga-clad men recline or sit on benches, shifting as speaker after speaker rises to opine on some matter of war, law, or finance. A young senator begins his first major speech, eager to make his mark. He has memorized pages of carefully composed Latin, modeled on the cadences of Cicero, but his delivery is stiff, his arguments meandering. At first, his colleagues listen politely. Then one senator, older and tired, allows himself a small yawn. Across the room, another follows. The young man's confidence falters as he sees mouths opening, noses flaring. The contagion spreads. He may finish his speech, but the yawns have already voted. This man does not command us. Cicero himself, master of rhetoric, surely understood the tactical importance of keeping a room yawn-free. His sentences wound their way through listeners' minds, but always with a rhythm, a rising energy, a hook that pulled attention forward. You can imagine him adjusting mid-speech if he sensed the energy dropping, using a pointed insult or unexpected image to snap the senators back from the edge of lethargy. In his world, a good orator did not just present arguments, he managed the collective physiology of his audience. Beyond the Senate, Rome had another solution to mass boredom: spectacle. The colosseums and arenas, with their gladiatorial contests and staged naval battles, were not just entertainment. They were political tools designed to keep the populace from turning their restlessness into rebellion. Bread and circuses, as the satirist Juvenal called it. Feed them and entertain them, so they do not think too hard about who rules them. A yawn in the cheap seats during a dull political speech might be overlooked. A yawn during the climax of a gladiator fight would be a failure of imperial planning. The whole apparatus of Roman public life was constructed, in part, to keep the jaws of the masses busy with food and shout, not yawns. Consider Julius Caesar, who understood that charisma is as much about energy as about ideas. When he addressed troops or crowds, he needed to project vitality, unstoppable momentum. The last thing he could afford was a formation of legionaries silently yawning as he urged them to cross a river or storm a hill. So he kept his addresses short, vivid, and urgent. He dramatized his own risks, his own wakefulness. The message was, "I am always awake, always alert. Follow me." The soldier who yawned in Caesar's presence was not just tired. He was, symbolically, out of sync with the pulse of conquest. Augustus, the first emperor, inherited a republic exhausted by civil war. His project was to stabilize, to calm, to lull Rome into accepting a new order. There is a difference between the yawns of boredom and the sighs of relief. Augustus's propaganda machine, poets like Virgil, monuments like the Ara Pacis, told a story of peace and prosperity. The people were meant to feel safe enough to relax, but not so disengaged that they ceased to care at all. It was a narrow path. Too much anxiety breeds revolt. Too much boredom breeds decadence. The yawns of Augustan Rome, if we could have measured them, might have told us whether the people felt quietly content or stupefied. As the empire grew older, official speeches and ceremonies multiplied. Each new emperor tried to legitimize himself with rituals, oaths, and parades. Over time, repetition dulled their impact. A boy who saw the triumph of one emperor might, 15 years later, see another very similar triumph with another shimmering chariot and similar slogans about eternal Rome. The novelty wore off. When citizens began to yawn during triumphs, if only in the privacy of their minds, it was a sign that the empire's dramatic narrative had worn thin. Each new ruler claimed to be a returning golden age, but the yawns said, "We've heard this one before." Even religion could not escape the contest with yawning. As new faiths spread through the empire, preachers and priests faced the same problem as politicians: how to keep listeners awake. Early Christian communities met in houses and quiet spaces, listening to letters being read aloud, tales of apostles and parables. These stories had to compete with the noise and spectacle of Roman life. A sermon that failed to move its audience risked more than boredom. Spiritual messages required emotional resonance. The contagious yawn became again a tiny indicator. Are these words reaching us, or is our attention drifting? By the time the Western Empire began to crumble, the political meaning of yawns had become almost too diffuse to track. Barbarians at the gates, soldiers unpaid, administrators corrupt. People yawned from hunger, exhaustion, and disillusionment. When Rome fell, no one blamed yawns, of course. They blamed invasions, economics, moral decay. But beneath those grand explanations is a quieter story. Millions of moments when citizens, soldiers, and slaves felt their eyes grow heavy listening to yet another proclamation that promised stability, that insisted nothing fundamental was wrong. Perhaps, in those last centuries, the empire's biggest enemy was not the sword, but the creeping sense that nothing new was being said, that the great Roman narrative had turned into a dull repetition. In that sense, a yawn could be a tiny, unspoken verdict on the empire itself. We are no longer fascinated. Across this long first stretch of history, from campfires to senates, from pharaohs to emperors, one pattern emerges. Power needs attention the way a fire needs oxygen. The yawn is a small, rebellious withdrawal of that attention, a momentary privatization of the self. It says, "I will retreat into my body for a second, whether you like it or not." Leaders learned, slowly and unconsciously, that if they wanted to rule, they had to manage not only land and armies, but also the invisible landscape of their subjects' minds and moods. They had to be, in a very literal sense, anti-yawn strategists. And yet, yawns refused to be conquered. They persisted in palaces and fields, in audiences and barracks, a democratic reflex equally available to the lowborn and the high. A slave could not openly disagree with a master's policy, but he could yawn in the master's shadow, if only when turned away. A scribe could not correct a king's decree, but he could press his lips against a rising yawn and feel the strain in his jaw, the quiet resistance of his own body. A senator could not always vote against a powerful patron, but he could let his eyes droop when that patron spoke. If we step back and look at this first part of the story, the history of yawns begins to look less silly and more revealing. Yawning is not just contagion. It is a barometer of engagement, a measure of how much reality feels worth staying fully conscious for. Prehistoric leaders faced it in its rawest form. Ancient civilizations dressed it in etiquette, ritual, and law. But in every age, the same question hums beneath high politics and grand events. Are people awake to what is being done in their name, or are they drifting away, one yawn at a time? Later, as we move into the medieval courts, revolutionary assemblies, and modern parliaments, yawns will continue to haunt the corridors of power. Kings will issue decrees to subjects who yawn in secret. Revolutionary leaders will try to turn yawns into shouts. Presidents and prime ministers will work tirelessly to appear awake, energetic, incapable of fatigue. But the reflex remains, stubborn as ever. a soft opening door in the face of grand speeches, reminding everyone that no matter how dramatic the times, the human mind has limits. For now, in this first stretch of our very contagious timeline, we can say this much. From the very beginning, politics has been, among other things, a struggle against the humble yawn. Leaders build statues and laws. The people, in return, offer their attention until they don't. Somewhere between those two lies the true history of power. A negotiation conducted through words, symbols, fear, hope, and, quietly, the uncontrollable urge to open one's mouth and inhale. As villages congealed into cities and cities swelled into empires, power learned to speak in longer sentences. Edicts stretched from a single command to paragraphs. Laws multiplied. Genealogies of kings were read aloud in meticulous order, from the divine founder to the slightly drunk cousin currently on the throne. And with every extra clause, every ceremonial flourish, every additional trumpet blast, the chances of someone, anyone, starting the chain reaction of a yawn increased. The yawn thrives in the gap between ambition and attention. Empires, more than anyone, specialize in that gap. In the dusty halls of the first bureaucracies, Babylon, Thebes, scribes bent over tablets and scrolls, copying royal decrees until the symbols danced. Clay dried slowly in the heat. Ink dried even slower. Somewhere in the middle of the seventh rendering of, "By the will of the gods and the timeless majesty of our person," one scribe's jaw shuddered loose in a wide, helpless arc. He tried to hide it. Decorum was already being born in those rooms. But the clerk beside him saw the widening mouth, felt his own throat itch with the need to inhale, and followed suit. Within minutes, the royal decree had generated a sort of counter-decree, a silent, expanding chorus of fatigue. The text, of course, survived. The yawns did not. Yet in the blank spaces between lines, in the strangely uneven wedges of cuneiform, one can almost feel the tremor. The first bureaucracy, encountering its natural enemy, the first institutional yawn. The rulers of early empires learned quickly that power was nothing if eyes were not on them. So they compensated. Statues grew taller. Crowns grew heavier. Processions lengthened so that the people might see the king's might from every angle, under every sun. Priests intoned the king's names, not once, but 7 times, 9 times, 17 times. If the people looked away, the gods, being properly addressed, would surely still be listening. But bodies are not trained as quickly as minds. After the 3rd recitation of a king's glory, after the 9th repetition of a flood story everyone already knew, after the 73rd drumbeat in a temple courtyard where nothing was actually happening, the collective nervous system intervened. Mouths opened, jaws dropped, eyes watered. The air itself seemed to pass from citizen to citizen as a wordless reminder. This moment may be historically important, but it is physiologically monotonous. It is tempting to imagine some early priest interpreting this phenomenon. Perhaps one Babylonian sage, annoyed by the sight of open mouths during a ceremony, declared yawns a minor offense against the gods. Perhaps another, more subtle, saw in the contagious reflex a sign of cosmic unity. Better that the people share a common breath than a common rebellion. What is certain is this: as soon as power began to monopolize speech, the yawn began to monopolize response. Nowhere was this tension clearer than in the political experiments of ancient Greece. Athens, with its assemblies and juries and ceaseless debates, was a theater of attention. To participate in democracy meant to listen, not once, but repeatedly, to speeches that ranged from thrillingly concise to catastrophically endless. The Athenian ecclesia, those great gatherings on the Pnyx Hill, were designed for voice. Acoustic engineering of the human throat, stone benches, open air, the slope perfect for projecting the opinions of one man into the ears of thousands. But what happens when the human throat prefers to open not in speech, but in a long, involuntary inhale? Picture an assembly discussing whether to go to war with Sparta, or whether to ostracize a rival politician, or whether to fund yet another set of triremes. Orators line up. One after another, they mount the bema and unleash arguments meticulously crafted to stir the soul and stir the treasury. The first speakers are dazzling. They speak with urgency. Hands slash through air. Metaphors sparkle. By the 5th speaker, repetition sets in. He is saying, in essence, what the second man already said, only with less charm. The sun beats down. Cloaks are heavy. The stone is hard. The sea breeze is faint. And somewhere in the front row, a citizen's jaw relaxes. The yawn rises. Just one. Perhaps he tries to cover it, hand over mouth, pretending to stroke his beard thoughtfully. But the contagion, once triggered, does its work. A man 2 rows behind feels the tug. He yields, stretching his face to the sky. Beside him, another follows. Before long, an invisible wave moves across the assembly, mouths opening like small, slow-falling dominoes. Democracy depends on counting hands, but here is a more honest poll, taking place beneath the vote. A count of mouths that can no longer bear the weight of words. The orators knew this. The best among them waged a quiet war against yawns. Demosthenes, who famously trained his voice by speaking over the roar of the sea, would watch his audience with a hunter's patience. A wavering gaze here, a slumping shoulder there, the unmistakable flutter of a suppressed jaw. These were signals, as meaningful as applause. They told him when his arguments flagged, when his examples failed, when his rhetoric needed blood. The line between a good speech and a great one was as thin as the line between a stifled yawn and a visible one. Even the philosophers, those dignified investigators of truth, knew the humbling power of this reflex. Socrates, engaging in his endless dialogues, must have encountered it often. A young man in the agora, opening his mouth wider than the answer required, eyes glazing as another "What is justice?" floated into the air. The Socratic method, for all its genius, is also a test of endurance. In some alternate, more honest version of Plato's dialogues, you can imagine a moment where an interlocutor does not respond with yet another carefully shaped sentence, but with that simple, treacherous gape. It would have been the most unanswerable argument of all, not against reason, but against duration. And if yawns haunted democracy, they equally haunted the carefully staged performances of aristocracy. Symposia, those wine-soaked evenings of song, poetry, and political plotting, were, in theory, the pinnacle of cultivated conversation. The best minds reclining, drinking in moderation, or not, trading speeches and verses deep into the night. In practice, at hour 6, even the most sparkling wit dims. Behind every brilliant toast to Eros or the virtues of the city lurks the possibility that half the guests are secretly suppressing the urge to unhinge their jaws. The polite yawn, half hidden behind a cup, is as much a part of the symposium as lyre music. The Greeks, who named and dissected so many human experiences, left the yawn without a full philosophical theory. But they lived with it in the most political of spaces, and every citizen who nodded off during a trial or ambled sleepily away from a late-night debate added to the wordless record. There are limits to how much politics any human being can absorb in one sitting. The Romans took the Greek fascination with politics and added something new: sheer volume. More laws, more offices, more titles, more ceremony. Republic first, then empire. Senate debates, popular assemblies, tribal voting. Then imperial edicts, palace councils, public games, triumphal processions. If the Greek city-state was a theater, Rome was a sprawling multi-part show, performed continuously with no intermission. In the Roman Senate, yawns were both more dangerous and more revealing. Senators were expected to maintain not only dignity, but a certain performative attentiveness. To be seen yawning while a powerful colleague spoke could be interpreted as an insult, a provocation, even a subtle declaration of opposition. Cicero, whose fame rested on his ability to occupy a room with sound, understood that the greatest insult an audience could offer was not heckling, but indifference. He watched the faces of his fellow senators as he attacked Catiline or defended Milo. If eyes brightened, he knew his words were landing. If heads drooped, if fingers fidgeted with the hems of togas, if, worst of all, jaws stretched in that telltale way, he felt the fragile hold of rhetoric beginning to slip. For all the Latin terminology of law and honor, there is a simpler measure at work in those chambers. How many men are still physically capable of staying awake? As the Republic decayed, the yawns in the Senate became more than signs of personal fatigue. They were signs of political exhaustion. The same arguments, about land, about debt, about the rights of tribunes, played out again and again with fewer genuine surprises and increasingly predictable outcomes. A yawn in that context was a quiet statement: we know how this ends. We have seen this before. Your outrage is no longer new. When Octavian transformed himself into Augustus, first citizen rather than king, he understood that control over time was as important as control over armies. He shortened some proceedings, streamlined others, and moved much of the real decision-making away from public view. Let the Senate keep its rituals. Let the yawns accumulate there. The true business of empire would be done in smaller rooms, at hours when those in attendance could be chosen for their wakefulness. Yet even emperors were not immune. Consider the imperial court, a theater of flattery. Poets recited odes, philosophers offered carefully measured counsel, provincial governors gave long reports about grain supplies and minor revolts. Somewhere between a flattering comparison to Jupiter and the third update on road repair in Gaul, even a god-king's eyelids can droop. Suetonius tells us of emperors drifting into debauchery, into madness, into cruelty. It would be equally accurate, if less dramatic, to imagine them drifting into boredom. Power's greatest curse is not opposition, it is repetition. The same petitions, the same ceremonies, the same wheedling voices. The imperial yawn, stifled behind a hand heavy with rings, is the most human thing in that palace. Eastward, in the bureaucratic courts of ancient China, yawns encountered a different political philosophy. Where the Greeks experimented with chaotic speech and the Romans perfected the spectacle of law, Chinese dynasties built systems of ritual. Confucianism, that intricate architecture of duty and hierarchy, left little room for unregulated bodily expressions. The imperial audience was a choreography of bows, words, and silences. Officials presented memorials, spoke in measured tones, withdrew at the correct angle. Everything that happened in the presence of the Son of Heaven had meaning. Everything had to be controlled. Within this structure, the yawn was both impolite and subversive. Impolite because it suggested a lapse in decorum, an inability to maintain proper appearance in the most sacred of spaces. Subversive because it indicated that even within a system designed to align the body with the state, an involuntary reflex could break the harmony. It is not hard to imagine a minor official, having risen before dawn, having copied texts late into the night, standing in the great hall as the emperor listens to report after report. The hall is cold, the speeches are long, the man's stomach is empty. As another colleague drones about irrigation in some distant province, the official feels that dangerous pressure behind his eyes. He clenches his jaw, his eyes water, his nose twitches. For a moment, he wins. Then, the yawn ripples through anyway, forcing his mouth open in a sudden, enormous intake of air. If spotted, such a lapse could be career-ending. So Chinese etiquette developed tiny defenses. Sleeves raised discreetly to the face, heads bowed at just the right angle to turn a yawn into a moment of apparent thoughtfulness. Manuals of proper behavior, in advising on how to sit, stand, and speak, indirectly acknowledge that the body remains stubborn. The human nervous system is a quiet Taoist, indifferent to Confucian scheduling. Yet the very attempt to regulate the yawn gave it a new political role. In a world where speech was limited by rank, where outright dissent was dangerous, the slightest visible slip, a twitch, a sigh, a suppressed yawn, became a potential text. Courtiers learned to read each other's fatigue. They saw who was truly engaged in an emperor's pet project and who was only feigning interest. Boredom, like loyalty, left traces. The yawn in such a system becomes a kind of leak, not of state secrets, but of sincerity. On the Indian subcontinent, empires rose and fell with their own elaborate court cultures. In the Mauryan and Gupta courts, as in so many others, politics unfolded in palaces thick with ritual. Ministers gathering at dawn, petitions read aloud, judgments handed down under carved stone and painted ceilings. Here, too, yawns played their uninvited role. The Arthashastra, that cold-eyed manual of statecraft attributed to Kautilya, is full of advice on spies, taxes, alliances, and punishments. It teaches kings to control appearances, never to reveal fear, anger, or weakness. It does not mention yawns, but the logic applies. A ruler who cannot manage his own face will struggle to manage an empire. Imagine Ashoka, before his famous transformation, presiding over matters of war and tribute. Generals argued for campaigns, treasurers counted coin, priests offered blessings. After the carnage of Kalinga, the emperor's conscience famously stirred. What is often left out of that tale is the fatigue that must have set in, the exhaustion of victory, the endless paperwork of conquest. He turned to Buddhism and Dharma, to a gentler conception of rule. But even the most enlightened edict, carved onto a rock and proclaimed in the villages, must confront the practical limit. How long can people listen? Under banyan trees, in village squares, local officials read the emperor's moral instructions. Do not kill. Be kind to animals, respect all sects. The message is noble. The sun, however, does not discriminate between moral and immoral edicts. It beats equally hard. Farmers stand with baskets of grain at their feet. Children fidget. Somewhere in the middle of a sentence about compassion, a jaw cracks open in a long, grateful yawn. Even messages about transcendence must pass through bodies that need sleep. Later, in the courts of medieval Indian sultans and kings, the yawn took on a different shading. Persianized etiquette, further codes of adab, emphasized self-control. Courtiers learned to police their faces as carefully as their words. The ideal nobleman did not laugh too loudly, did not show anger impulsively, did not yawn in the presence of his ruler. Politeness, at this level, is just an elaborately choreographed battle against reflex. Religion, perhaps the oldest claim to ultimate authority after raw force, has had an ambivalent relationship with yawns. On the one hand, religious rituals are among the longest, most repetitive human activities. On the other hand, faith often insists on full attention, full submission, which yawns stubbornly refuse to guarantee. In the great councils of the early Christian Church, bishops argued over the nature of Christ, over the wording of creeds, over which gospels were to be canonized. These were charged meetings, full of passion and political maneuvering. They were also, by all accounts, long. Latin and Greek droned across cold halls, theological distinctions turned on single syllables. Picture a bishop from a distant province, jet-lagged in an era without jets. He has taken weeks to travel to Nicaea or Chalcedon, enduring storms and rough roads. Now he sits on a hard bench as learned colleagues debate whether the Son is of the same substance or of similar substance to the Father. Each argument is important. Each is also nearly indistinguishable to a tired mind. Eyes close, heads nod. A yawn slips out. Instantly, it acquires meaning. Is this bishop yawning because he is bored with orthodoxy? Because he secretly favors the opposing party? Because he drank too much at last night's collegial dinner? The body's need to stretch and inhale becomes fodder for suspicion. Islam, with its keen attention to bodily comportment in worship, goes further by explicitly commenting on yawns. In prophetic traditions, yawning is described as something the devil delights in. Believers are urged to suppress or cover it during prayer. Here, the yawn is given not just social but spiritual weight, an opening in the mouth and perhaps in the soul where distraction enters. Yet the advice itself, repeated in mosques and homes, betrays a simple fact. People yawn in prayer. In the middle of recitation, during sermons, in long nighttime prayers of Ramadan. The faithful stand, bow, prostrate, and somewhere between the second and third cycle, a jaw loosens. Imams learn to read this just as Cicero read the Senate. A sermon that provokes tears is one thing. A sermon that produces synchronized yawns is another. The theology may be sound. The delivery, perhaps, is not. And in congregations from Damascus to Delhi, a quiet battle plays out between belief and biology, between the desire to focus on the divine and the inexorable pull toward bed. Monasteries, too, heard their share of yawns. The rule of Saint Benedict prescribed regular hours of prayer, day and night. Monks woke before dawn to chant psalms in cold stone churches. They prayed again mid-morning, midday, mid-afternoon, at sunset, and deep into the night. The idea was to sanctify time, to make every hour a conscious offering. The body, meanwhile, remained aware that 2 or 3 in the morning is not an ideal moment for extended vocal recitation. The nocturnal office overflowed with yawns, sometimes suppressed, sometimes not. In their cell, a monk might write about battling demons of temptation. In the choir, he battled the demon of fatigue. There is a kind of humility in this. All grand religious systems, all lofty doctrines, eventually have to confront the simple fact that no human being can stay alert forever. The yawn levels clergy and laity, saint and skeptic. At some point in a long sermon, everyone is just a mammal with a limited attention span. In feudal Europe, politics moved from city assemblies and imperial courts to castles and manors. Power became more localized, more personal. The Lord's Hall replaced the Senate. The king's audience chamber replaced the public forum. Yet even in these smaller spaces, the negotiation between authority and boredom continued. Vassals swore oaths of fealty, long strings of words binding them to service, loyal standard, and obedience. The formulas became day forward. To you, I will be faithful and loyal, and so on. Kneeling on cold stone, repeating words that had been repeated 1,000 times, a knight's mind might drift. His jaw might drift with it. Unlike in a mass assembly, though, yawning before one's immediate overlord carried more immediate personal risk. The yawn, in this context, was not just impolite. It could be read as a subtle insult, a suggestion that the bond being formed was not worth full attention. So yawns in the feudal hall retreated back into the body, suppressed as much as possible. The effort to hide them, however, only made their political significance clear. Here, in miniature, was the constant tension of the age. Lords needed their men to listen. Men needed to pretend to care equally about every utterance from a superior's lips. The reflex in the jaw told a more honest story. Courts that grew more elaborate, especially the royal courts of France, England, and later Spain, faced the old imperial problem. Too many ceremonies, too many rituals, too much repetitive flattery. Nobles who spent hours each day attending the king, waiting for moments of favor, endured long stretches of tedium punctuated by flashes of excitement. At Versailles, centuries later, nobles would fight for the privilege of handing Louis XIV his shirt. Long before that, lesser courts had already discovered the politics of waiting. In those long corridors of anticipation, yawns flourished like weeds. They were, paradoxically, both symptoms of subordination and tiny reminders of individuality. However much a man might abase himself for favor, his nervous system remained on its own schedule. The Church, deeply intertwined with feudal power, held councils and synods throughout the medieval period. Bishops and abbots assembled to settle disputes, condemn heresies, redistribute land. Latin echoed in vaulted spaces, scribes scribbled, tempers flared and cooled. Some of these meetings lasted days, even weeks. The chronicles preserved the decisions, the excommunications, the pious speeches. They do not preserve the monk in the back row who yawned so wide during a debate on clerical celibacy that his jaw clicked audibly, causing half his bench to jump and two nearby bishops to shoot him scandalized glances. History remembers the heresy, it forgets the jaw. On the steppes of Central Asia, where Mongol horsemen gathered in Kurultai to decide matters of war and succession, yawns encountered a different environment. These assemblies were shorter, rougher, more urgent. Decisions mattered immediately. Who would command which army? Which campaign would be launched where? Lives and empires hinged on the outcome. But even here, in the bracing cold, with fermented mare's milk flowing and war drums beating, the human body could not entirely escape its rhythms. Travel to a Kurultai meant days of riding. Nights were rarely restful. Warriors, wrapped in furs, listened as elders, shamans, and clan leaders spoke. By the time a compromise was reached or a Khan acclaimed, more than one set of jaws had opened to the sky. If anything, the nomadic context made the cost of boredom clearer. A leader whose speech provoked yawns risked not just his dignity, but his authority. Steppe politics were personal and immediate. Attention could not be commanded by architecture or ritual alone. A yawn in that circle of riders, on that windy plain, was almost an early warning system. This leader is losing his grip. Better find a sharper tongue, or a sharper successor. Perhaps this is why steppe decisions were often quick. Better to ride out while everyone is still wide-eyed than to wait for fatigue and its companion doubt to seep in. The history of lightning Mongol campaigns can, in one fanciful light, be seen as a political culture's desperate attempt to outrun the first yawn. Across these ancient and medieval worlds, the pattern repeats with regional variations. Wherever power speaks at length, yawns eventually answer. Where authority seeks ritual, yawns leak through the cracks. Where obedience is demanded, yawns quietly insist on the body's own priorities. They are rarely recorded, almost never theorized. Yet they haunt the margins of political life. In the background of a Roman senator's tirade, a single yawn can spread through the benches, turning an impassioned speech into an accidental lullaby. In the courtyard of a Chinese palace, a tiny movement of the jaw can betray an official's inner distance from his emperor's obsession. In a church council, a yawn can become an involuntary commentary on how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. The humble yawn does not plot revolutions. It does not sign manifestos or carry banners. What it does, relentlessly, is reveal the limits of control. No ruler, however absolute, can command a subject never to feel tired. No ritual, however sacred, can abolish circadian rhythms. No ideology, however total, can eradicate the nervous system's need to stretch, breathe, reset. As feudal castles begin to give way to walled cities and merchant councils, As Latin gives way to vernaculars and illuminated manuscripts give way to printed pamphlets, politics will change again. Power will move closer to the crowd. Speeches will become more frequent, more public, more urgent. New ideologies will demand not just obedience, but enthusiasm. Kings will be questioned, parliaments will emerge, revolutions will stir. And with each new attempt to claim the full, burning attention of the people, the old reflex waits calmly in the wings, jaws ready. The next stretch of our contagious timeline belongs to those who believed they could abolish boredom with ideas alone. Reformers, revolutionaries, visionaries. They will shout louder than any emperor, speak faster than any bishop, and print more words than all the scribes of antiquity combined. The question, as always, will be whether the people listening can stay awake. The yawn arrives in the age of pamphlets as a veteran of quieter courts and cloisters, only mildly curious about this new thing called public opinion. It has seen rulers try incense, sacred music, and jeweled robes to hold a room's attention. Pamphlets are just the next glittering distraction. Still, something is different now. The talking has moved. Instead of murmured counsel beside a throne, words spill out in coffeehouses, taverns, rented halls. Speeches grow longer. Arguments more intricate, crowds larger. New devices emerge to convert boredom into law, procedures, minutes, committees. The yawn, long a private reflex, begins to discover its political power. It becomes an unspoken vote of no confidence, a tiny, involuntary rebellion against the speaker's claim to one's full waking life. In the early parliaments of the modern age, politics and fatigue finally become inseparable. Imagine the chamber at Westminster during the long 17th century. Candles dripping, air heavy, wigs powdered with something vaguely floral and emphatically stale. The benches are hard, the hours irregular, and the language, while dramatic, is lengthy in a way that only men paid by the word can sustain. Members rise to declaim about prerogative, popery, property, and precedent. Some are brilliant, many are not. The first backbench yawn must have felt like a small revolution. Of course, no one records it. The journals of the House note divisions, bills, petitions, not the quiet choreography of eyelids drooping in the gallery. But we can infer their presence from the simple arithmetic of time. If a speech runs for 3 hours in a room of 200 people, and the human jaw behaves then as it does now, it is not questions of taxation that move most seamlessly through the chamber, but that slow, contagious opening and closing of mouths. The yawn spreads along the benches, politely disguised behind cuffs and lace. It is, at first, an embarrassment, a breach of decorum. But soon enough it becomes part of the unspoken language of the place. A man might never heckle his own leader. He may nonetheless allow his jaw to speak its mind. While the House debates, the coffeehouse refines the art of the political yawn. In London, Paris, Boston, and Amsterdam, a new kind of public emerges. People who come not to worship or obey, but to listen and argue. The room is thick with tobacco smoke, spoons ring against cups, and someone is always standing on a chair explaining why the world must be entirely rearranged at once. The talk is sometimes brilliant, often self-indulgent, and almost always too long. Here, the yawn takes on a new function, criticism. Where a courtier's yawn might offend a king, a coffeehouse yawn offends only the speaker and his pride. A man caught boring the table watches his ideas dissolve as his audience's jaws begin to stretch in an epidemic of barely concealed disinterest. No need to shout him down, the body has spoken. In this way, yawns perform a crude but effective form of peer review. Only those ideas that can keep a room awake after midnight survive to be printed in pamphlets by dawn. The Enlightenment likes to imagine itself as an age of perpetual intellectual wakefulness. Candles burn late over manuscripts. Philosophers write solemnly of awakening minds from their dogmatic slumbers. Yet, behind the rhetoric, the practical reality remains. Most treatises are too long, most lectures too dense, and most human beings need sleep. The yawn, indifferent to the rhetoric of reason, interrupts a discourse on liberty exactly as it interrupted a sermon on original sin. If priests had once pleaded with congregations to stay alert for the sake of their souls, Enlightenment lecturers now plead with audiences to stay alert for the sake of their reason. The yawn does not care. It has no theology, no ideology, no party. It only has timing. Across the Atlantic, in the years leading up to revolution, town hall meetings and colonial assemblies struggle with a problem that no empire can be blamed for: the attention span of free people. In a New England meeting house, men gather to argue about taxes, representation, and the meaning of rights they have long taken for granted. Their complaints are fervent but repetitive. The language is warmed over law, warmed over scripture, warmed over Locke. Windows fog with breath, the air smells of wool and damp wood. Outside, horses snort and stamp. Inside, someone is speaking for the third time about the same clause in a royal charter. A yawn begins in the back row. No one is being forced to attend. There are no soldiers at the door, no bishop's eye glaring from a stained glass window. Attendance is voluntary, participation a privilege. And yet the body grows weary all the same. Democracy, it turns out, is not immune to tedium. The right to assemble peacefully includes, in practice, the right to be bored peacefully. At the Continental Congress, the stakes are higher and the yawns more dangerous. Here, the hours stretch unreasonably as the delegates negotiate both with each other and with the fact that their chairs are unforgiving and their ink runs slow. Resolutions are drafted, redrafted, read aloud, amended, read again. The language of independence becomes precise by becoming verbose. One can picture a delegate, decent and patriotic, fighting his eyelids as Jefferson drones through a revised paragraph listing the injuries of the crown. The man knows he is witnessing history. His grandchildren will boast of it. Still, his jaw widens. He pushes it back with an effort. A second later, the man beside him catches the contagion and silently joins. Liberty is being proclaimed. The oldest reflex in the room insists that liberty can wait until after a nap. Yet it is in revolutionary France that the yawn faces its first truly existential political crisis. The Estates General, reborn as the National Assembly, meets in stifling halls, crowds packed into galleries, every word of every speaker charged with suspicion. The revolution prays for fervor, demands engagement, seeks to turn the whole city into one great wakeful mind. "Citizens," cry the orators, "France is awake." This is not entirely accurate. Even in 1789, a typical human day is still 24 hours long. Bedlines require early rising, and long walks from the faubourgs to the debate halls leave people already tired by the time they find a seat. Once inside, they discover that revolutionary speeches are no shorter than royal ones. They are merely louder. Hours pass. The air settles into an emulsion of sweat, dust, and rhetoric. A man in the galleries tilts his head back to get a better view of the speaker and accidentally offers an ideal runway for an approaching yawn. But yawning in the gallery acquires a new political interpretation. To fail to appear inflamed by virtue might be taken for indifference to the nation's destiny, or worse, sympathy for enemies of the people. A jaw opening wide at the wrong moment might be misread as a sneer. The safest course is to disguise fatigue as passion. A yawn becomes a shout, a stretch, an applause. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, in committees drafting constitutions and decrees, the yawn enjoys a less endangered existence. Bureaucracy, even in its revolutionary infancy, knows how to breed it. Lawyers argue over the placement of commas that might alter the meaning of sovereignty. Clerks copy out the same phrases again and again. The guillotine awaits the politically suspect. The yawn stalks the overworked and underslept. It is, in its way, another instrument of leveling. Noble and commoner, Jacobin and Girondin, all slump over the same piles of paper. When the revolution burns itself out and gives way to an emperor, the yawn simply adjusts to new uniforms. Napoleon understands spectacle. He arrays his troops in endless lines, stages coronations, dictates bulletins meant to be read aloud in every village square. He compresses political time into campaigns and decrees, hoping that momentum and glory will keep France permanently at a peak of attention. Yet even his bulletins must be read by tired mayors to tired villagers, already worn out from harvest or war or worry. The first lines, full of thunder, hold them. By the time the dispatch reaches the fine points of supply or the minor reorganization of another conquered territory, the mayor's voice has settled into a rhythm that invites only one bodily response. From the back of the crowd, a yawn slips free. It will not be recorded in the imperial archives. It leaves no trace in treaties or memoirs, but it is there and it spreads. The same reflex moves through the ranks of soldiers as they listen to officers reading orders that were urgent 2 days ago and are now stale. The campaigns are brilliant. The marches between them are long, monotonous, and exhausting. Boredom is one of the few enemies the Grande Armée never defeats. After every great convulsion comes a conference, and after every conference, boredom. The Congress of Vienna, so often remembered as a dazzling festival of balls and diplomatic intrigue, is also a masterclass in political tedium. Behind the glitter, committees haggle endlessly over borders, titles, and indemnities. Maps are unrolled, lines are drawn, erased, drawn again. Speeches in French, German, Russian, and the universal patois of compromise coil around each other like smoke. Diplomats become connoisseurs of fatigue as a professional tool. An endless speech can be a tactic, a way of grinding down an opponent's resistance through sheer verbal attrition. The yawn becomes a weapon and a danger. To yawn too openly is to signal that the tactic is working, to cede psychological ground. To suppress it is to suffer inwardly for the sake of one's sovereign. Still, in the late hours, when the candles are shorter than the agendas and the ink stains look like small continents of their own, the illusion of total control weakens. The diplomat's carefully neutral face softens into that universal pre-yawn slackness. History is being carved into Europe's map. The body negotiates instead with sleep. The 19th century, with its parliaments proliferating and its empires expanding, becomes the golden age of the professional bore. Legislatures meet more frequently and for longer sessions. Public administration expands in scope and detail. For every fiery debate quoted in schoolbooks, there are dozens of hours of procedural drudgery where nothing happens except the slow wearing down of vertebrae and patience. Within many parliamentary cultures, an entire etiquette of the yawn develops, mostly unwritten. New members learn how to disguise them in coughs, how to time them for moments when the cameras, when there are cameras, are not yet watching, how to turn them into what looks like reflective silence. The parliamentary yawn is selective, a trained reflex that betrays more or less about one's loyalties depending on how well one manages it. A member, bored by his own side, must become an artist of concealment. But if official politics is increasingly a matter of clock time and paperwork, the 19th century is also the age when crowds begin to gather in earnest for mass politics, and there, yawns acquire a theatrical dimension. Nationalism, socialism, liberalism, conservatism, each arrives promising a new world and inevitably finds itself explaining that new world in speeches that last 2, 3, 4 hours. Mass meetings in fields and squares become rituals of collective endurance. Flags wave, bands play, and then someone steps forward to talk for a very long time. Here, the contagious nature of the yawn takes on an almost allegorical character. A leader who can hold a crowd without triggering that first yawn in the 10th row is hailed as a natural orator. His appeal is measured not just in applause, but in the absence of that subtle wave of opening mouths that, once started, can sweep through thousands like a physical vote of disapproval. Conversely, a badly timed drone on tariffs or railway monopolies can undo an afternoon's careful staging. The audience, having marched for hours to attend, having endured sun or rain or police, finds itself betrayed not by the courage of the speaker, but by his inability to land a sentence. One pair of jaws cracks open in the distance, then another. Soon, the energy leaks out of the gathering like warmth from an open window. People shuffle, glance sideways, drift toward the edge of the crowd. The meeting is not dispersed by force. It is dissolved by fatigue. Industrialization layers a new kind of tiredness onto the political yawn. Factory work and long shifts give the 19th century worker an intimate relationship with exhaustion. When the working day stretches from early dawn to late evening, any meeting, trade union, mutual aid society, political club, competes not with the temptations of leisure, but with the body's straightforward need for rest. In a dimly lit hall near a railway yard or textile mill, a speaker explains the injustices of piece rates, the necessity of organization, the strategy for the next strike. The cause is urgent. The room is hot. Men and women, still smelling of oil or dye, sit on benches that would not pass inspection in a church. Their eyelids grow heavy. A yawn here is not apathy. It is physics. The human frame has limits, and political commitment cannot erase them. Organizers learn to cut speeches shorter, to intersperse them with songs and jokes, to break up the flow of words with call and response chants. The yawn teaches them the practical grammar of agitation. Vary rhythm, change tone. Let people stand up before they fall asleep upright. As politics slowly opens its doors to women, yawns acquire yet another layer of interpretation. In suffrage meetings, in drawing rooms turned into organizing spaces, in chapels and town halls, women sit through explanations of rights that have long been denied them. They already bear the compound fatigue of domestic labor, paid work, and social expectation. Late at night, after children are put to bed and dishes washed, they gather to listen and plan. When a young woman at the back of the hall yawns, it is easy for a hostile observer to attribute it to female nerves, to a supposed emotional fragility that allegedly disqualifies women from politics in the first place. The irony is almost too neat. Centuries of exclusion have kept women out of political boredom. Now, as they fight to get in, they are accused of not being alert enough. The yawn becomes one more piece of evidence misread by those who wish to keep things as they are. Within the movement itself, however, the yawn is more often understood as the enemy of efficiency. Suffrage organizers, many of whom are experienced at managing households that run on tight schedules, have little patience for long-windedness. Minutes are kept, speakers timed, agendas structured. One eye is always on the clock, the other on the faces of the audience. When jaws begin to loosen, it is not taken as a personal insult, but as data. Change tactics, break for tea, pass around petitions. The goal is not to shame the reflex, but to outrun it. In the far-flung territories of empires, yawns cross cultural boundaries long before many political ideas do. Colonial administrators, convinced of their civilizing mission, produce endless reports and proclamations. They speak of progress, responsibility, and the burdens of empire in sentences weighed down by subordinate clauses. These documents are read aloud by interpreters to villagers gathered under trees or in dusty courtyards. People summoned from their work to listen to news that was written elsewhere in another language weeks or months earlier. To the listeners, the words may be obscure or plainly insulting. What is clear is that the day is hot, the shade is patchy, and the voice at the front is monotone. Yawns bloom, discreetly at first. No rebellion is announced, no riot planned. Yet, in the quiet stretching of jaws is a small, unarticulated assertion. Life here has its own rhythms, its own urgencies, and they do not align with the pacing of imperial proclamations. At the same time, anti-colonial movements begin to use long meetings of their own to develop strategies and solidarity. Here, yawns can be dangerous, misread as lack of commitment or as infiltration. Yet they are unavoidable. In cramped rooms lit by a single lamp, activists argue about tactics late into the night while the city sleeps. They fight not only an empire, but the ticking of the clock in their bones. The yawn passes from one to another like the secret they all share. This work is necessary, but it is also exhausting. By the late 19th century, the cult of the orator reaches a new peak. Figures like William Jennings Bryan in the United States, orators of Chartism or Irish nationalism, and various demagogues across Europe cultivate their ability to hold an audience in thrall. Newspapers gush over their spellbinding speech that lasted 3 hours and left the crowd breathless. What the papers do not report are the private tests that precede such performances, the small meetings where a speech is refined based on how quickly yawns appear. A skilled speaker understands that the yawn is a more honest critic than applause. Applause can be coerced by social pressure or stage-managed by planted supporters. Yawns are harder to fake and nearly impossible to suppress beyond a certain threshold. The orator watches the back rows, the edges of the crowd where attention is weakest. When faces there are still, he is content. When mouths begin to open, he shifts, cuts a planned anecdote, raises his voice, shortens his sentences. Political charisma consists not solely in inspiration, but in continuous tactical war against boredom. Around this time, science begins to take a formal interest in yawning. Physicians and early psychologists dissect the reflex with the same earnestness they apply to hysteria, melancholia, and the other fashionable maladies of the mind. They propose theories that yawning cools the brain, that it oxygenates the blood, that it is a vestigial remnant of some ancestral communication. They note its contagiousness with scholarly fascination. Some of this research is presented at medical congresses and scholarly societies whose proceedings are, inevitably, interrupted by the very phenomena under investigation. A lecturer on the physiology of yawning watches his audience's mouths widen one after another and scribbles a note to himself about suggestibility. He does not write down the more obvious conclusion that no body of knowledge, however abstract, can exempt itself from the basic constraints of attention. Meanwhile, cartoonists and satirists seize upon yawning as a political symbol. Newspapers publish caricatures of legislators dozing on their benches while the nation's problems pile up around them. A single exaggerated yawn stands in for whole systems of complacency and delay. The word sleep sprouts metaphors. Sleeping giant, sleeping electorate, the nation must awaken. Political activists promise to rouse the people as if the citizenry were a single drowsy person who merely needed a shake. Into this world of speeches in print comes the telegraph and, in due time, the telephone, speeding up information without necessarily making it more gripping. News travels faster. Boredom travels with it, merely accelerated. Political news becomes a daily habit, fed by newspapers that each morning inform readers of debates they did not attend and meetings they will never see. Columns of text march down the page in small type. Readers skim headlines, start an editorial, and abandon it halfway through. Their eyes glaze not from lack of interest, but from sheer overload. The yawn follows suit, now triggered by the accumulation of static rather than the extension of a single sound. By the end of the 19th century, the stage is set for politics to move beyond print and the live voice into a new era of mediated spectacle. Cameras begin to whir. Phonographs capture fragments of speech. Soon, politicians will no longer have to share a room with their audiences to attempt to hold their attention. They will project themselves into parlors and music halls, and later into living rooms, car radios, and glowing screens. They will gain unprecedented reach and discover that reach is not the same as grip. The old reflex waits, still unimpressed. It has endured empires and revolutions, sermons and enlightenments, parliaments and pamphlets. It has been misread as insolence, frailty, even treason. It has broken the spell of demagogues and whispered to the overburdened clerk copying out the 19th version of a clause. It has acted as critic, saboteur, and, occasionally, honest friend, reminding the citizen activist that there is a limit to what any nervous system can process in a day. The 20th century will bring microphones, mass rallies amplified by loudspeakers, radio addresses that quiet whole cities, and films in which leaders stride across giant screens. It will bring regimes that attempt to organize human attention with the same ruthlessness with which they organize labor and terror, that seek to exterminate not only opposition, but indifference. It will bring democracies awash in polling data, advertising, and campaign jingles, all designed to ward off that fatal slackening of interest. In that coming age of sound and image, the yawn will find itself both more visible and more policed than ever before. For now, at the close of the long 19th century, it reclines on the threshold, jaw easing open, following the cables and railroad tracks that are knitting the world into a single continuous field of communication. It does not know politics as such. It recognizes only the ancient oscillation between attention and its absence. But it is patient. Every new technology of persuasion, every new ideology that claims to banish boredom forever, is to it nothing more than a fresh performance in an old theater. The lights are dimming. The curtain is about to rise on the age of mass media. Somewhere in the darkness, a mouth opens. By the time the new century has gathered itself into the word 20th, the yawn is no longer a minor embarrassment on the fringes of public life. It has become something dangerous, a visible lapse in attention at the very moment when attention is being organized, counted, measured, militarized. Newsreel cameras whir in parliaments and congresses. Microphones bloom like metallic flowers in front of podiums. The faces of leaders are enlarged on cinema screens, later on glowing glass boxes in living rooms, and each face is now a potential battlefield where wakefulness must defeat its oldest rival. The yawn, which has never cared about politics, suddenly acquires political meaning simply by being seen. A leader who speaks while someone yawns in the frame behind him appears weak. A crowd that yawns in unison becomes a plebiscite of fatigue. The old, private gesture becomes a tiny, treasonous referendum held inside the jaw. There is a new anxiety among statesmen and propagandists. Not only, how can we win hearts and minds, but also, how can we keep eyelids aloft? In the last days of peace before 1914, as the great powers parade their uniforms and their brass bands, a curious drama plays out. On boulevards and against palace facades, soldiers march, flags ripple, speeches proclaim the glory of nation and emperor. The official photographers capture rows of uplifted faces. What they do not print are the moments between, when some conscript at the edge of the crowd, kept standing in the sun for hours, opens his mouth in a wide, involuntary gape. His sergeant, perhaps, snaps at him. Show some respect. The criticism is not aimed at the lungs or the jaw, but at the heart. A yawn, in the new language of visibility, looks like disbelief. There remains, of course, the older meaning. On the night trains carrying mobilized troops toward the front, men yawn from lack of sleep and the dull ache of hours. They are still in the old world of bodily necessity. But as the trains pull into stations decorated with banners and cheering crowds, those sleepy mouths are suddenly framed by flags and slogans. The cameras, those omnivorous new eyes of the 20th century, swivel toward them. A young soldier, caught mid-yawn in a newsreel that will be shown in Paris or Berlin, may find his private drowsiness interpreted as the first crack in the national will. In the trenches that follow, the yawn returns to its ancient intimacy with tedium and fear. War, stripped of its romantic clothing, turns out to consist largely of waiting. Waiting for orders, for rations, for letters, for artillery, for death. Between bombardments, men crouch in dugouts or lean against sandbags, smoking, staring. Yawning not in boredom exactly, but in that paradoxical exhaustion that comes from being tense for too long. The yawn here is unmistakably physiological, a body trying to re-regulate itself under impossible conditions. Yet even in the mud, politics brushes against it. Commanders worry about war weariness, that vague but dreaded syndrome in which fighting spirits falter. Reports speak of listless troops, slack discipline, lackluster salutes. Behind such language, you can almost see the chronic yawn. The soldier who does not snap to attention, but stretches his jaw in a soft, unmilitary arc. At home, governments wage their own battle against this contagion. Posters show alert, bright-eyed soldiers staring into a heroic distance, bayonets gleaming. No one yawns in propaganda. Yawns are what the enemy does. They are lazy, decadent, demoralized. Our side is always wide awake. Yet the yawn seeps through. A woman on a tram, exhausted from shell factory shifts, opens her mouth and covers it with a gloved hand. A bureaucrat in a war office, drowning in paperwork, yawns as he stamps yet another form. The home front is held together not only by patriotism, but by routine. And all routines, sooner or later, call up their old companion. In the wake of the war, when treaties are signed in ornate halls and new borders are drawn with chilled pens, the yawn attends the birth of the so-called New World Order with a skeptical, almost insolent regularity. Diplomats sit through hours of speeches about self-determination and peace, their bodies battling jet lag, though the term is not yet coined, fatigue, and the boredom of repetition. Somewhere in the rows of officials, a jaw cracks open. A hand flies up too late to cover it. A neighboring envoy, seeing it, feels the familiar trigger at the back of his own throat. Contagion works even on those whose business is to appear impassive. The interwar period becomes a golden age of parliamentary yawns. Liberal democracies, old and new, pride themselves on open debate, on the airing of differences in representative chambers. But debate is often talkative and long-winded. The procedural state produces procedural sleepiness. Backbenchers listen to lectures on tariffs and agricultural quotas that stretch into the small hours. Rules of decorum multiply, including the unwritten injunction against visible fatigue. To be caught yawning while a party leader is speaking can ruin a young politician's reputation. The press will describe him as unserious, disrespectful, unsound. This fear creates an odd choreography, jaws clenched against impulse, eyes widened, tongues pressed firmly against teeth. The body must learn to disobey itself for the sake of appearances. If parliaments and congresses are the theaters of established democracies, the streets and squares are the stages of movements that seek to replace them. Fascists and communists, nationalists and populists all discover that attention is their most precious resource. Rallies become laboratories of arousal, designed to keep yawns at bay through intensity alone. The new mass leaders, Mussolini on his balcony, Hitler at the podium under the searchlights, Stalin before the microphone in Red Square, understand that to rule the body politic, you must first master the bodies in front of you. They learn to modulate their voices, to use pauses, crescendos, and sudden shouts not unlike those of a music hall performer. The goal is to create a current strong enough that no one in the crowd will have a chance to remember how long they've been standing, how little they slept, how much their feet hurt. Yet crowds are made of stomachs as well as souls. However thrilling the rhetoric, however rhythmic the chants, each person's musculature remembers its own needs. In photographs of enormous demonstrations, if you look away from the central figure and study the anonymous faces in the outer ranks, you will sometimes find someone in mid-yawn, a man whose jaw is stretched to the limit as if resisting the entire ideology, a woman who has looked away from the flags and slogans long enough to succumb to her own chemistry. The authorities are not amused by such images. Totalitarian regimes, acutely aware of optics, begin to patrol not just speech, but demeanor. In party congresses and mass meetings, officials stationed along the aisles scan the audience for signs of slackness. The press is instructed to crop or discard photos in which anyone appears inattentive. Cinema editors excise yawns from newsreels as ruthlessly as they remove dissenting statements. In the most paranoid systems, the yawn becomes a tiny crime. In Stalin's Soviet Union, where even a joke can be treasonous, the boundary between bodily impulse and ideological statement nearly vanishes. There is the whispered anecdote about a minor official at a regional party meeting who, after 3 hours of monotonous reports, leans back and yawns. His neighbor glances around, panicked, and jabs him sharply in the ribs. "Do you want to be shot?" he hisses. Whether this story happened or not is almost beside the point. What matters is that it can be told, that the yawn is imagined as something that could cost a person their life. The Nazi regime carries out its own campaigns against tiredness. Posters exhort workers to maintain vitality in service of the nation. Photographs of Hitler speaking always show rapt, uplifted faces, their eyes lit by devotion. What these carefully composed images do not reveal are the realities of those endless Nuremberg rallies. The stiff backs, the cramped legs, the waves of fatigue that roll through the ranks after hours of standing. Somewhere, inevitably, someone opens his mouth wider than propriety allows. Somewhere, another sees the movement and feels his own jaw respond. Even in a field drilled into perfect geometric order, the old contagion finds its way. In the United States during the same period, yawns are less dangerous but not less politicized. Franklin Roosevelt's fireside chats, carried by radio into millions of homes, are designed partly as an antidote to despair and partly as a sedative. Their tone is calm, reassuring, almost hypnotic. Listeners lean back in armchairs, eyes heavy, soothed by the cadence of the president's voice. Some nod off entirely. Yet here the yawn may be almost friendly, a sign not of rejection, but of trust. To fall asleep while a leader speaks can be a vote of confidence in his ability to keep the world from falling apart overnight. The difference between sedating and boring is subtle but profound. Authoritarians fear yawns because they hint at disengagement. Democrats sometimes court them, hope that a certain level of routine dullness will be preferable to the fever of fanaticism. When the Second World War arrives, the yawn is once more conscripted. Soldiers fight, but they also wait. Coast watchers scan the gray horizon for hours on end. Radar operators stare at glowing screens in dark rooms, their bodies sliding monotonously through shifts. Air raids wake cities at ungodly hours. Sleep is fragmented, rationed like food and fuel. Governments talk of morale. Medical officers talk of fatigue. The yawn speaks the language of both. In bomb shelters, children yawn from exhaustion and adults from a mixture of tiredness and suppressed panic. The political order of the world is being violently rearranged, but these people's muscles operate on the same primitive cycle as the hunters and gatherers of prehistory: exertion, rest, vigilance, collapse. After 1945, as the rubble is cleared and institutions are rebuilt, a new kind of yawning begins to haunt politics: the bureaucratic yawn. International organizations arise, committees proliferate, working groups study problems in subsection detail. The United Nations assembles in a chamber whose design is almost explicitly theater-like, complete with a stage and rows of seats. The speeches delivered there are noble and necessary, but they are also long. Delegates listen through hours of formal address, translations arriving through headphones in voices as toneless as rain. Television cameras now carry these images across the globe. Somewhere, a viewer sees a diplomat in the second row tilt his head back slightly, his jaw dropping almost imperceptibly before his hand covers it. That captured yawn, broadcast to millions, becomes a quiet commentary on the limits of idealism and the endurance required by multilateralism. At the same time, the colonial empires that had dominated the previous century begin to fray and dissolve. In the administrative offices of those old empires, yawns have been common for decades. District officers in remote outposts filling out reports in the heat, clerks stamping forms in capital cities, natives summoned to hear proclamations delivered in a foreign tongue. For those whose lives are governed without their consent, the forced listening to imperial speeches is another kind of labor, and the yawn becomes a modest, if risky, expression of distance. In the meetings and rallies of anti-colonial movements, energy is initially high. The leaders of independence speak with the urgency of those who feel history pressing on them. Crowds stand in open fields or gather under makeshift awnings, listening raptly. Yet even revolutions have slow afternoons. At some point, a child tugging at his mother's skirt yawns, bored by terms like constitution and sovereignty. A farmer, who has worked since dawn before walking miles to attend the meeting, sways with fatigue and opens his mouth wide, eyes closed briefly in relief. After independence, when new governments discover the prosaic work of governing, budgets, infrastructure, committees, the yawn returns with redoubled force. The promise of transformation meets the reality of administration. Leaders who once kept crowds awake with visions of freedom now speak about water projects and 5-year plans in rooms filled with civil servants. Some of those servants, having sat through hundreds of such speeches, feel the familiar tingling, the heaviness in the jaw. Behind their hand, they yawn. Meanwhile, the Cold War begins to freeze the world into two antagonistic blocks, and with it comes a peculiar union of adrenaline and monotony. On one hand, there is constant talk of existential stakes, of nuclear annihilation, of history's final showdown. On the other hand, much of the conflict plays out in meetings, memoranda, and waiting. In underground bunkers, military personnel sit before consoles, watching blips of light that may or may not herald the end of civilization. They must remain alert for hours, days, years. Manual are written about vigilance. Caffeine becomes its own small arms race. And yet the body knows only that it has been sitting in one place too long. A watch officer, eyes burning from the glow of screens, yawns, and the technician next to him, drowsy from the same stale air, catches the contagion and yawns in turn. The much-feared chain reaction of Cold War strategists, one missile launch provoking another, is mirrored by this humbler chain reaction of drowsiness. Diplomats shuttle between Geneva, Vienna, New York, Helsinki, engaging in what will be called arms control talks and strategic dialogues. The language is abstract, the stakes immense, the proceedings often tedious. Delegations sit across from each other at long tables under fluorescent lights. Each side reads out its position in careful, monotonous phrases that have been cleared by superiors in advance. Interpreters murmur in controlled tones. The yawns that move through these rooms are usually well hidden, but they are there, surfacing in the pauses, covered swiftly with protocol-conscious hands. Television covers some of this, but it is more interested in its own new genre, the political debate. In 1960, when John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon face each other before the cameras, advisors fuss over makeup and lighting, over sweat and stubble. They understand that a raised eyebrow, a nervous blink, an awkward smile can sway millions. A yawn, in this context, would be catastrophic, a sign of being overwhelmed, or worse, a visible insult to the opponent and the viewers. So the candidates steel themselves. The lights are hot, the questions rehearsed, the format carefully negotiated. Behind the scenes, staffers and journalists, condemned to sit through hours of preparation and waiting, are less disciplined. In the corridors and press rooms of the television studios, reporters stretch and yawn, technicians rub their eyes. Politics is becoming a show, but every show has its tired crew behind the curtain. As television spreads, leaders learn to modulate not just their words, but their rhythms. They are told to keep speeches shorter, to vary tone and pitch, to to punctuate arguments with anecdotes. Pollsters begin to ask not only, "Do you agree?" but also, "Did you watch to the end?" Ratings become a new kind of plebiscite. Falling numbers are interpreted as boredom, a dangerous sign in an age when disengaged citizens may change the channel rather than march to the voting booth. In classrooms during the turbulent 1960s and 70s, as professors and teachers attempt to explain Vietnam or civil rights or decolonization, students yawn, both from late nights and from the ever-present suspicion that the adult world's explanations are inadequate. In mass lectures about Marx or Keynes or behavioral psychology, the political yawn surfaces as a form of critique, albeit an inarticulate one. When a lecturer drones on about the end of ideology while the world outside rages, the yawn seems to say, "You have not convinced me that my attention is safe in your hands." On the streets, the politics of attention takes new forms. Sit-ins and teach-ins and occupations weaponize duration. Activists deliberately stay in one place for long periods, refusing to obey the ordinary rhythms of work and sleep. They know that authorities will try to outlast them. The yawn is their constant companion, moving through the ranks of protesters at 3 a.m., threatening to thin their numbers. Police on overnight duty yawn behind riot helmets. The struggle is no longer only over laws and policies, but over whose bodies will remain present. Totalitarian societies, wary of such emergent tactics, double down on their attempts to regulate boredom. In the Eastern Bloc, party congresses and May Day parades are televised, their imagery carefully curated to demonstrate enthusiasm. Citizens learn to stand on sidewalks for hours, watching tanks and rockets glide by. They learn the art of the discreet yawn, head turned slightly away from the cameras, hand in the right place, eyes still aimed vaguely forward to simulate interest. In some of these countries, dissidents express their rejection of official narratives not just through samizdat literature or clandestine meetings, but through the deliberate display of weariness. To yawn openly in a meeting of the Youth League, to gaze at the ceiling while the party secretary speaks, is to flirt with danger. It is also to assert that one's inner life has not been completely colonized. In the affluent West of the late 20th century, politics undergoes another transformation. Ideology begins to lose its sharp edges in mainstream discourse. Grand narratives of class struggle or racial destiny give way, in many places, to talk of pragmatism and management. The credit card and the shopping mall promise satisfactions that movements once monopolized. In this environment, the yawn becomes less a specific insult to a speaker and more a chronic condition of the electorate. Turnout declines, party membership falls, voters describe politics as boring, all the same, just talk. Television news, sensing its audience's restlessness, begins to shorten segments, to emphasize personalities over policies, conflict over process. Talk shows and soundbites become the dominant forms. The yawn is still there, but it has moved from live events into the living room. In that living room, a child sprawls on the carpet while adults half listen to a debate. The child yawns, largely indifferent to the arguments but sensitive to the deadening tones of practiced rhetoric. The mother, returning from work tired, yawns too, partly in sympathy, partly in simple exhaustion. On the screen, a candidate promises reform and efficiency in phrases that sound like a corporate presentation. The gap between the lived fatigue in the room and the abstract talk of energy and dynamism grows wider. Politicians respond, again, by trying to manage attention. They hire consultants to test slogans in focus groups. They adjust the length of speeches to match what advertisers claim is the average viewer's decreasing attention span. They cultivate moments of unscripted humor, or apparent unscripted humor, to jolt audiences awake. Occasionally, genuinely spontaneous events occur, a sharp exchange, an unexpected outburst, and the yawn recedes temporarily, beaten back by adrenaline. But no technique completely abolishes it. The yawn is not impressed by spin. In some corners of political life, boredom is embraced as a virtue. In Northern Europe, commentators praise dull politics, seeing in it a sign of stability and maturity. Better a boring democracy than an exciting dictatorship, goes the slogan. The ability to yawn without fear becomes, paradoxically, one of the quiet triumphs of liberalism. To be able to say, "This meeting is tedious," without risking prison or worse, is a form of freedom, albeit one that rarely makes the headlines. Yet even in these orderly societies, the yawn can turn into a warning. When too many citizens find the entire system tedious, when parliamentary debates seem like procedural theater with no stakes, when the language of politics hardens into cliché, new actors appear promising to banish boredom. They speak in simpler, more emotional terms. They gesture, shout, improvise. They pose as entertainers as much as leaders. Some of them are Democrats, some are not. All of them, whether consciously or instinctively, understand that one way to break the hold of established parties is to attack their greatest vulnerability, the perception that they are boring. In rallies and televised appearances, these new figures strive to keep their audience's jaws clenched in laughter or indignation rather than slackening into the open O of tedium. The 20th century draws toward its close with images that would have been unimaginable 100 years before. Presidents joking on late-night comedy shows, premiers photographed jogging in tracksuits, ministers fielding call-in questions on radio programs. Politics merges further with entertainment, in part as a strategy against the deadly sin of being dull. The yawn, watching all this, remains unmoved. It has seen empires rise and fall, ideologies flare and fade. It has infiltrated trenches and top-secret bunkers, colonial offices and independence rallies, parliaments and politburos. It has been punished and tolerated, hidden and inadvertently broadcast. Now, as the century's last televisions flicker into the static of midnight, something else is happening just off stage. New circuits of communication are being laid, fiber optic cables in the seabed, satellites in orbit, the first hesitant connections between personal computers. Attention, which had been organized by a small number of powerful broadcasters, is about to be fragmented into billions of channels. The yawn does not know about bandwidth or algorithms. It knows only that when faces turn towards screens, eyes will glaze. When messages multiply, some will fail to hold. In the coming storm of information, it will find more opportunities than ever to move silently from person to person, from one glowing window to the next. The century of mass rallies and televised debates is ending. The age of networks and notifications is about to begin. Somewhere, in front of a monitor humming with a connection that has barely yet been named, a jaw cracks open, as if to say, "I am still here." In the blue light of those early monitors, politics tried to follow the signal. Cabinets and committees acquired email addresses. Press offices built websites whose pages loaded one line at a time, images descending like curtains in slow motion. In the time it took a photograph of a handshaking summit to resolve from pixels into faces, an aide could yawn twice without missing a word of the official statement. C-SPAN cameras, steady and unblinking, watched as empty chambers slowly filled, then emptied again. While at home, a small, scattered viewership tried to stay focused. The new 24-hour news channels needed to fill every minute with interpretation and counter-interpretation. If nothing happened, they replayed the same clip, summoned the same panel. One host, 4 guests, 5 carefully cultivated brands of outrage. The opening music strove to jolt, but the segments stretched and repeated until jaws slackened in living rooms and airport lounges and hotel bars. The yawn, which had learned the timing of parliaments and the tempo of dictators' orations, tested this new terrain. It found graveyards of attention among late-night policy debates, among the scrolling headlines that repeated the same facts in slightly different words. It drifted through the air-conditioned halls of network headquarters, where producers dozed in rotating shifts before banks of monitors, and it slipped invisibly through the static to the viewer who left the television on for company. In committee rooms whose microphones were now wired to the world, backbenchers leaned back in their chairs and covered their mouths, a gesture still for the colleagues in the gallery, not yet for the millions. A camera caught one of them, mid-yawn, in the background of a minister's emphatic remarks. The clip circulated among insiders as a small joke. Even we are bored by ourselves. Outside, in suburban bedrooms lit only by phosphorescent screensavers, a different sort of yawn spread. The one that comes when text piles upon text, and every message could be urgent, but most are not. Citizens who had once received politics in a fixed dose, an evening bulletin, a morning paper, now found it dripping into their inboxes at all hours. Legislative alerts, campaign appeals, chain emails warning of looming conspiracies. They scrolled, skimmed, forwarded, and somewhere between the 3rd and 4th paragraph of a particularly breathless warning about a proposed law, their jaw opened of its own accord. The century turned. The screens grew brighter, the connections faster, and then one clear morning, the sky itself was split, and for a stunned interval, nobody yawned at all. In the days after towers fell and smoke billowed across a major city's skyline, the world's collective nervous system spiked. Televisions that had become background noise snapped back to the center of attention. Faces leaned in, eyes widened, breaths shortened. In such moments, the ancient reflex knows its place. Alarm pushes it aside. Bodies are prepared for fight or flight, not for drowsy contagion. But bodies cannot hold that tension forever. As the weeks lengthened into months and the Chiron remained red, the maps of distant mountains and unfamiliar cities rotated on screen in endless loops. The same grainy training camp footage played beneath the scrolling list of new security measures and color-coded alerts. Legislatures rushed through emergency bills in the dead of night. In the galleries, relatives of the dead watched with clenched jaws. On the benches below, some lawmakers did too. Others, exhausted by negotiations and arm-twisting, rubbed their eyes as the cameras panned past. Soon enough, fatigue seeped in at the edges of fear. Words like homeland, axis, preemptive entered the lexicon, and then, through repetition, lost some of their initial shock. A million pundit hours were spent parsing the same phrases. Citizens fell asleep in front of late-night war coverage, the drone of distant artillery and studio analysis blending into a metallic lullaby. In armchairs and on couches, the yawn reclaimed its territory, the space where the body chooses rest over vigilance, where shock is metabolized into a dull ache. It learned quickly that the new politics of permanent emergency carried within it an inexhaustible reservoir of tiredness. There were deployments and surges, briefings and press conferences, yellow and orange alerts. Each required the performance of vigilance. Each extended the moment when that vigilance could must finally, collapse. Soldiers in desert bases yawned through third-shift watch, their faces caught in the glow of ruggedized laptops streaming hometown news. Anti-war activists yawned in buses on the way to marches that would loop endlessly through social feeds, yet appear to change little. Intelligence analysts yawned in windowless rooms before monitors dense with data, trying to keep eyes open for the anomaly that might, this time, matter. Even as armies moved and alliances realigned, another front was opening on the glowing rectangles now slipping into every pocket. The early social networks, at first more concerned with status than states, knitted together campuses and cities and finally countries. What had once been a web of pages became a mesh of people, each node broadcasting thoughts, photographs, and, soon enough, political beliefs in real time. Campaigns sensitive to any new microphone climbed aboard. The canny candidates team launched blogs, posted behind-the-scenes photos, asked supporters to join the conversation. A young, charismatic figure capitalized on platforms that his opponents barely understood. His staff, hunched in rented office spaces with exposed brick and fluorescent light, refreshed dashboards showing likes, shares, signups. The old retail politicking, the handshake at the factory gate, the rally in the fairground, was supplemented by targeted messages arriving in inboxes with the intimacy of a personal note. In the hope-colored glow of 2008, volunteers stayed up late to call voters in distant time zones, their voices hoarse, eyes rimmed red, yawns stifled between, "Hello, my name is," and "Can we count on your support?" In data caves and message testing rooms, researchers watched focus groups watch advertisements, noting when eyes glazed, when glances drifted to phones. The yawn became a measurable variable, a sign that the line had gone on a beat too long, the slogan repeated once too often. At the same time, everyone with a phone became a potential broadcaster of boredom. A legislator caught yawning during a head of state's major address could be screenshotted and shared within moments, a looping commentary on inattention. The yawn, once a private signal of a body's needs, was drafted into the war of optics. Proof, in the hands of opponents, that a leader did not care, that a representative could not even stay awake for the issue at hand. Mouths that had long tried to hide the reflex behind decorum now did so for an invisible, judgmental crowd. Animals, too, were conscripted. A photo of a yawning cat in front of a televised debate circulated with captions about how we all feel right now. A gif of a monkey yawning through a ceremonial parade became a shorthand for the gap between pomp and relevance. The yawn drifted through these images, subtly reasserting its oldest meaning: the mismatch between stimulation and need. For some, it was a joke. For others, a quiet protest. The performance of engagement politics demanded, "Stay tuned, join the live stream. This changes everything," frequently metaphysiology that could not be tricked forever. And then, suddenly, crowds in a separate part of the world stopped yawning and started shouting. The first images from the squares came through shaky mobile cameras, chants echoing against concrete, banners rippling in dusty air, fingers in the air, phones held high. Autocrats who had ruled for decades looked out at seas of faces and saw, at last, a refusal to keep dozing through another speech, another election staged and stolen. The uprisings that would be named after a season unfolded in real time on feeds used, just months before, to coordinate birthday parties and post-holiday photos. In those squares, the yawn took on yet another role, the grim, necessary companion of revolution. Nights spent in tents, bodies pressed against cold stones or warm asphalt, wakeful watches punctuated by rumors and sudden dispersals. These are hospitable environments for the reflex that balances alertness with fatigue. Protesters yawned at dawn after chanting through the dark. They yawned in the pauses between marches, sitting in circles to debate what should come after victory. Cameras caught these yawns as well, unremarked, in wide shots broadcast around the world. Far away, viewers sat up late to watch live streams. Their time zones did not align with the squares, and so their revolution was experienced through the watery eyes and slack jaws of 3 a.m. solidarity. They wrote messages of support, shared links, refreshed timelines until their heads nodded and their fingers slackened on trackpads. The yawn crossed continents at light speed, not as a contagion of indifference, but as a mark of the body's insistence, even in moments of fervor. You may care deeply, but you still must rest. A more subtle contagion spread alongside the images of raised fists. The idea that politics, long thought to be the domain of professionals behind podiums, could again be made in streets and squares. For a moment, leaders elsewhere looked out at their own populations with unease. They tightened laws on assembly, increased surveillance, refined their messaging. They learned, as those before them had, that one way to neutralize a potential uprising is to exhaust it, to drag negotiations out, to multiply meetings, to bury demands in procedure until the rhythm of outrage gives way to the slower rhythm of attrition. In conference rooms from Brussels to Washington, that tactic took its purest form. The great financial crisis that followed on the heels of war ushered in a different kind of emergency. Abstract, statistical, but devastating. Here again, elite gatherings were broadcast, if not in full, then at least in curated images. Leaders entering glass buildings at midnight, ties loosened, press conferences at 3 a.m., eyes heavy, reading statements about stability and necessary pain. Within those rooms, yawns were plentiful, though rarely seen. Assistants dozed in chairs along the back wall, while heads of government argued over decimal points. Journalists stationed outside the summits yawned on camera as they filled airtime with speculation about white smoke, about breakthroughs delayed until yet another dawn. Viewers at home, confronted with graphs and acronyms, felt their attention slide away. The connection between the numbers on screen and the rents, wages, and pensions in their own lives shimmered, then blurred. Yet that blur did not mean passivity. In city squares, newly familiar from other struggles, tents appeared again, this time bearing slogans about debt, inequality, the rule of markets. General assemblies stretched into the night, with hand signals replacing microphones. Here, in circles of hundreds trying to reach consensus on every procedural detail, the yawn became a measuring stick of endurance. A proposal too long-winded produced waves of it. A process that ran too many hours without food or sleep met a collective, involuntary refusal. The most committed activists learned that attention is not infinite, that any movement which ignores the body's limits will eventually be claimed by them. Inside glass towers, a different class of professional, the consultants and data analysts now central to campaigns, were making their own peace with bodily fatigue. As smartphones migrated from luxury to necessity, the ability to contact voters at any hour, in any place, became irresistible. Notifications pinged through pockets as buses lurched, as cashiers made change, as children asked for stories. A petition here, a fundraising appeal there, an urgent alert about an opponent's statement, all competed with messages from friends, from employers, from other causes equally convinced of their own primacy. Doom-scrolling entered the vocabulary without needing definition. Fingers flicked endlessly across polished screens, eyes tracking outrage to outrage, scandal to scandal, poll to poll. The yawn in this environment was no longer only a mark of boredom. It was the body's protest against an overloaded attentional system. Lying in bed in the dim glow of a phone, a person might feel simultaneously wired and exhausted. Mind racing while jaw stretches wide, tears beating in the corners of eyes. Politics, which had once occupied a few discrete windows in the day, now seeped into the last moments before sleep and the first moments after waking. It became possible to fall asleep halfway through reading about a coup, a policy that would reshape healthcare, a court decision affecting millions. Leaders adapted. Some understood instinctively that in this arena, brevity trumped depth, provocation beat explanation. A businessman turned politician, fluent in the language of spectacle, discovered that messages delivered in short, furious bursts could dominate feeds and mandatory attention cycles. His early morning posts jolted supporters awake, sent opponents into spirals of outraged quote sharing, and set the day's media agenda before many had taken their first sip of coffee. Yet even among his followers, the relentless pace had a cost. The body can only sustain high alert for so long before slipping into a different rhythm, one where yawns come not from a lack of stimulation, but from too much. The news felt like a fire hose, the yawn like a small, private act of resistance, a refusal to grant each controversy the same inner acceleration. Some began to tune out altogether, silencing alerts, uninstalling apps. Others continued to read compulsively, yawning their way through threads they could not quite look away from. In legislative chambers and press briefings, the old etiquette around yawns eroded further. The cameras were everywhere now, streaming not just official speeches, but also the in-between moments. A minister whispering to an aide, a representative rubbing temples, a judge suppressing a yawn during hours of oral argument. Clips of such lapses went viral, grafted with captions that ascribed intention where there was only physiology. A head of state struggling with jet lag after a long flight to a summit was declared bored by climate, indifferent to allies. Breathing became a political act. Then, as if to remind humanity that the most basic biological facts still outrank all its codes and feeds, a novel virus moved silently across borders. It hijacked the very infrastructure that yawns serve and signal, lungs and breath. Sleep became both refuge and threat, a time when symptoms might worsen unnoticed. Governments that had for years prioritized spectacle over substance were forced to stand, night after night, in front of cameras and deliver charts and numbers and instructions about hand washing. The yawn in those months took on unusual meanings. In hospital wards, it was edged with fear, a patient struggling for air, a nurse working without adequate protection fighting off exhaustion. In homes where work, school, and every other social function had collapsed into rectangles on a single screen, yawns proliferated as days blurred into nights. "You're on mute," someone would say, and the little square of a colleague, mid-yawn, would suddenly become the focus of the call. Parliamentarians voted from kitchens with unshaven chins and tired eyes, occasionally caught stretching jaws wide as the proceedings dragged on. Lockdown politics alternated between frantic urgency and a deadening repetition. Press conferences updated death tolls and restrictions in toneless cadence. Citizens learned the phrases "flatten the curve," "social distancing," "essential workers," and then repeated them until they felt worn thin. Conspiracy theories and protests against basic public health measures coalesced in forums, chat rooms, and real-world gatherings where anger tried to infect more bodies than the virus already had. The yawn floated through this turbulence as well, marking the moment when horror and anxiety were temporarily displaced by the body's need for repair. In the improvised home studio of a head of state, a teleprompter scrolled. On the other side of the camera, a nation listened, or did its best to. Children fidgeted on couches, partners multitasked in open-plan apartments. Somewhere in that vast, dispersed audience, a teenager stayed up late to watch a briefing, eyes stinging from a day's worth of online classes. As the leader's speech moved into its familiar conclusion, "We will get through this together," the teen's head tilted back, and a yawn cracked across their face, unseen, private, as old as the first fireside tales. As the immediate crisis receded fitfully, other, slower crises pressed forward, some newly visible, others merely no longer ignorable. The atmosphere warmed, seas rose, forests burned with a ferocity that turned skies the color of bruises. Young people, raised in the glare of screens and the buzz of constant connection, stood outside parliaments with signs and slogans, accusing their elders of somnolence. "You are sleepwalking us into catastrophe," they said, often in so many words. Cameras once again captured leaders at international summits devoted to the planet's future. They nodded through presentations of graphs that curved ominously upward. They repeated commitments made and unkept. In one heavily circulated clip, a major powers president appeared to close his eyes for a moment too long during a speech about emissions. The still image, mouth slightly open, head dipped, was instantly read as a yawn, as fatigue in the face of extinction. The comment threads filled with fury. If those in charge could not stay awake for this, what hope was there? Of course, the body does not care about symbolism. It cares about circadian rhythms disrupted by flights and jet lag, about endless meetings in windowless halls, about long stretches of performing attention while listening to translations through earpieces. The yawn, in such settings, says nothing more and nothing less than, "I am tired." Yet, in an age when every twitch can be screenshot and interpreted, that purely physical signal becomes entangled with questions of moral seriousness, of empathy, of care. Meanwhile, far from cameras, in communities where rising waters forced relocations and failed rains threatened crops, yawns arrived for less dramatic reasons. The fatigue of working 2 jobs, of attending community meetings, of caring for children at night and organizing by day. Politics at this scale, local, untelevised, is a slow grind of zoning boards and grant applications. The yawn here is not a betrayal, but a fellow traveler, a reminder that the fight for shelter, dignity, survival must share space with sleep. As governments and corporations deployed ever more refined tools to track behavior, the yawn itself began to appear in datasets. Facial recognition software trained to detect emotion learned to categorize drowsiness. Car dashboards beeped if drivers yawned too often, suggesting arrest. In some speculative scenarios, authoritarian systems imagined monitoring citizens' engagement with official broadcasts, measuring not just whether a device was tuned in, but whether a face remained alert. A yawn, in such nightmares, could become a punishable offense, evidence of disrespect, of insufficient enthusiasm for the leader's words. Yet, even in more benign settings, the impulse to optimize attention raised questions. When algorithms are designed to minimize boredom, to serve, always and immediately, something that will hold the eye, what happens to a politics that has often relied on boredom's byproducts, reflection, disengagement, the slow processing of complex information? If an app senses that you are yawning and switches to more stimulating content, does it also make it harder for you to sit through the information that requires effort, that is not instantly gratifying but necessary for informed citizenship? Leaders, too, became subject to these pressures. Advisors armed with engagement metrics urged them to shorten speeches, simplify messages, personalize everything. The long policy address gave way to the clipped video, the threaded post, the meme. In private, even the most telegenic of them yawned through prep sessions, through mock debates, through the repetition of lines designed to be sound bites. The carefully choreographed authenticity of the behind-the-scenes yawn, the candidate framed as human, tired from working around the clock for you, joined the repertoire of campaign imagery. The yawn, once a private lapse to be hidden, now oscillated between scandal and strategy, between evidence of contempt and proof of devotion. Its sincerity could never be entirely fixed. It remained stubbornly ambiguous, a bodily event that exceeded spin. As the timeline stretched toward the present, with its overlapping crises and micro-crises, its viral videos and actual viruses, its summits and street marches, a pattern emerged that the yawn understood instinctively. Politics, in all its forms, from decrees pronounced before carved stone to announcements pushed to phones at midnight, asks for attention. It demands that individuals orient their minds and sometimes their bodies toward words and symbols, toward the actions and inactions of those who wield power. The mechanisms for capturing that attention have grown ever more elaborate, ever more invasive, but the capacity to give it has not changed. It remains bounded by the cycles of a heart, the limits of a nervous system, the need for sleep. The yawn sits precisely at that intersection. It is a contagion, like enthusiasms and fears. It spreads through crowds at rallies, through parliaments, through offices where staffers wait for the results that will decide their futures. It is also a boundary marker, a quiet assertion that no matter how urgent the notification, no matter how fiery the speech, the body reserves the right to signal, enough for now. In this sense, the history of yawns is not merely a history of boredom with politics. It is also a history of politics' dependence on bodies that can never be fully subordinated to its timetable. Every coup, revolution, campaign, reform, betrayal, and compromise has unfolded among people who, at some point in the day, could not keep their eyes from drooping or their jaws from stretching. Decisions about war and peace have been made by leaders fighting off yawns at 3 in the morning. Petitions have been signed and unsent emails abandoned when a would-be activist fell asleep at their desk. Somewhere, right now, a leader stands backstage waiting for the cue. The lights leak through the curtain, bright enough that they see only their own reflection. An aide runs through the key points of the speech one last time. Another checks the feed where comments are already accumulating under the live stream announcement. Outside, a crowd has gathered. Some because they believe, some because they are angry, some because they were passing by and had their curiosity piqued. In the throng, faces turn toward the stage or toward phones held aloft to capture it. Some eyes are bright, expectant. Others are shadowed from a day's work. Somewhere in the middle, somebody who has been standing too long, who slept poorly, who is not sure why they came but came anyway, feels their jaw begin to ache. Their mouth opens, unbidden. They cover it with a hand, out of habit more than shame. The person next to them sees the yawn and feels their own muscles respond. A few rows back, another follows. The wave of it passes through the crowd, barely visible amid the chanting and the rustle of signs. On the stage, the leader feels a familiar tickle at the back of their throat as they wait for the applause cue. They hold it in. The cameras will be on in a second. The live stream begins. The comments scroll. Notifications flash on phones far away. So-and-so is live now. Some tap to watch, others ignore. Some will sit rapt, some will wander away mid-sentence. Some will fall asleep with the sound still playing. The algorithms will note time watched, will optimize future content accordingly. The polls will shift, or not. The pundits will, as they always have, explain what it all meant. Through it all, the yawn, the quiet, contagious insistence of mortal bodies, remains. It moved through the fields where early rulers addressed their scattered subjects, through the colonnades of empires, through the smoky halls where revolutions were plotted, through the rallies and radio eras and televised debates. It slips just as easily through fiber optic cables and Wi-Fi, from one glowing window to the next. It does not care about slogans or brands, about left or right, about trending topics. It cares only about oxygen and fatigue, about the ancient dance between wakefulness and rest. History will continue. New platforms, new crises, new leaders promising they alone can keep you safe, make you heard, deliver the future. They will find novel ways to seize attention, to keep you watching, scrolling, reacting. And at some point, as the speech runs long or the feed refreshes once too often with nothing truly new, you will feel it again. The slow, inevitable swell in your throat, the spreading warmth across your face, the welling in your eyes. You will open your mouth, inhale, and the timeline, for one small, necessary moment, will blur at the edges. The age of networks and notifications has begun, and whatever comes next will ask more of your gaze and your nerves. But somewhere inside that demand, a quiet, contagious timeline persists, indifferent to power, yet shaping, in its own minor key, the experience of being political animals. Somewhere, in front of a screen whose resolution exceeds anything the last century imagined, a jaw cracks open, as if to say to the world of leaders and events, you may change your costumes and your stages, you may multiply your channels and refine your scripts, but I am still here.